Dr. Nye joins us as an assistant professor from Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. How many here are from GSWS? Do you want to just raise your hand? Fantastic spirit. Thank you for turning out. Welcome to everyone else who's able to be here. What's interesting about her background is it's non-traditional. And I did a little theater too. She doesn't know that. But her doctorate is in theater arts and performance studies from Brown University for a dissertation called Stages of Risk: Economies of Ambivalence in Cancer Genetics. But her background is in anthropology and gender, sexuality, and women's studies in unique and interesting ways. And that leads to critical methodologies that unfold in really interesting ways in the classroom. And Dr. Nye has agreed and has participated in some of these, what does Bettina call them? The outreach to high school students? Yeah, when we're big in recruiting and having parents up, and I remember you speaking in the mini lecture in some kind of way. Her background is in, she's interested in feminist science studies, disability studies, bioethics, co-author of really cool things, an ethnographic novel about medical promise, friendship, and revolution. She works on graphic novels and design, comics.
Yeah.
That's a graphic novel? Yeah. So she's performing non-traditional modes of publication in the academy, and I say go for it. And finally, teaching comics in a medical anthropology and humanities class. Is that right? Her style has been identified by her teaching colleagues as creative, participatory, interdisciplinary. She's getting quite a reputation after a very short number of years here as a teacher. And this is really cool. She has a teaching, learning, development grant project for universal design learning in the classroom, which practices not only issues to do with practical pedagogies of inclusion and ability/disability studies, but anti-oppressive pedagogy in general. So I'm really delighted Dr. Nye can be with us today. In addition, we have two student moderators. We have Nathan Flagg is here. Nathan, welcome. Thank you very much. He is a recent grad of the MA program in GSWS, background in communications and religious studies, which is a great non-traditional background, well done, and has interests around a whole range of things directly relevant to the discussion today. Is Terry Lucas here? Terry, also welcome. An MA student currently in GSWS, background in English studies from Sheffield, and again, intersectional feminism, gender representation through non-traditional media, academic media. Really delighted that they will be able to co-create the discussion. I will now turn over the proceedings to the star of today. Oh no, you don't need that. Okay. All right, that's excellent. Thank you very much.
So before we start, I want to thank you all for coming out today. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm a guest here on unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations. So from the slide, you see that I'm giving you an introduction as a genetic portrait of gender in North America. So your initial response might be, oh, so she's going to tell us about how genes code for gender. So this image is a stock image. You can probably see it says Getty Images. It's a stock photo. And it represents 2 sex chromosomes. So what genders do you think that these chromosomes represent? This is where you answer. What's that? Men. Okay, which one's men? Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so you think that the one on the top so it's dominant. All right, this is great. We're already telling gene stories. Okay, so one story might be that the top gene is the dominant gene, and so this is a male, or the chromosome rather, and so this is a male chromosome. Okay, another story that someone wants to tell about this photo? Taylor?
It looks like it is female because I see all the X's.
Okay.
Chromosome, I don't see any Y's.
Okay, yeah, so the pink X's maybe, and the pink is female.
Yes, I would say based on the color.
Okay, color. So maybe so maybe the blue is male, and the little blue Y's are male. All right, so we're already telling a story about gender in the genome, and scientists tell these stories too. This is an example of a kind of playful scientific take on the X and Y chromosomes in different areas that they code for. So you can see that this one, husband's credit card control locus right here, susceptibility to eating disorders here, repetitive requests to tidy up, this is the nag locus. All right, so this is a playful scientific rendering, actually, of the X and Y chromosomes. So this is a really good example of how scientists are also already drawing upon gender norms to tell stories about our genes. Now, you might be surprised to learn that the X chromosome is not pink and it's not female. And the Y chromosome is not blue and it's not male. What I mean by that is they don't actually demonstrate stereotypical masculine or feminine traits. The Y chromosome isn't actually dominant or aggressive, even though the stories that we tell about them might reinforce a particular narrative. And they also don't always code for sex. There are lots of other traits that the sex chromosomes code for that have nothing to do with biological sex. And there are also lots of variations in the chromosomes beyond XX and XY. And there are lots of different genders that you can have if you have an XX or an XY chromosome even. Nonetheless, the stories that we tell about these things are really powerful, and they don't just happen in our social worlds, they also happen in the scientific worlds. So one of the things that I want to bring us to today is to think about the ways in which, far from being this kind of neutral objective space set apart from the social, science is always already a social practice. And the stories that we tell and the social categories that we draw upon in our social worlds actually shape the kinds of questions that researchers ask. And they also shape the types of research that gets done. And that in turn shapes our own social worlds and categories and perspectives. And so there's a feedback loop between the social and the scientific, and they aren't these entirely separate domains. So the story that I'm going to tell you today is a story about breast and ovarian cancer genetics, and to think about what social stories breast and ovarian cancer genetics can tell us through scientific and medical practice. So for those of you who may or may not be familiar with the BRCA genes, there are two recent public figures that you might be aware of. So Angelina Jolie in 2013 disclosed that she carries a BRCA gene mutation. And most recently, Liberal MP Judy just stepped down from her position because she and her family have been dealing with a BRCA gene mutation. So what are the BRCA genes? Angelina Jolie, she's going to be the expert that we follow through this entire talk. She's not, but she does have a lot of expertise, as we're going to talk about. So she describes this as a faulty gene. So she has inherited a genetic, so every one of us has a BRCA gene. It's a tumor suppressor gene. If you have a mutation in it, some mutations in it make it function improperly, so it doesn't suppress tumor growth. She has inherited one of these. It increases her risk for breast and ovarian cancer significantly. It also increases risk for skin cancers, pancreatic, prostate, uterine, and other cancers. So faced with the reality that she carries this genetic risk for cancer, she made the decision to preventively remove her breasts and her ovaries so that she doesn't develop the same cancer that killed her mother. Now, today, I am going to talk about three things that I think are really interesting about the case of the BRCA gene. So first, I'm going to talk about, using Angelina Jolie, actually, I'm going to talk about how medical policies and practices around genetic testing often rely on and reinforce racialized gender norms. I'm then going to talk about how the genetic technology itself is also shaped by social norms of inequality. And then I'm going to conclude by turning to those who have been oftentimes marginalized within dominant regimes of genetic research and testing to see what types of insights they might give us and how to do better genetic research and how to have a more just medical practice and better treatment. So we'll start with the first one. So in her op-ed piece that she published in 2013 in the New York Times, Jolie said, "I do not feel like any less of a woman after my surgery." And the surgery she's describing is preventively removing her breasts. Instead, like this is a choice, it's a strong choice that in no way diminishes my femininity. Now, why do you think she felt the need to say this? This is another opportunity for you to actually answer me. Okay, all right. So if she's having her breast surgically removed, there's a possibility that she might feel like her femininity is under fire or being challenged. And so she feels a need to make a claim that no, in fact, like whether or not I have breasts, I still have femininity. She actually got very fancy reconstructions, so she also does have breasts. So this is a really common link, a reduction of femininity and womanhood to secondary sex organs and to reproductive organs, such as ovaries. And this is a connection that has actually been made really consistently within breast cancer culture and larger cultures around this that tend to highlight and center stereotypical performances of gender, femininity that are often classed, upper middle class, raced as white. And to do this as a way of kind of upholding these gender norms in the face of bodily transformations that come through cancer treatments, right? Hair loss, loss of bodily organs, loss of sexual function, these types of things. Now you see this, for example, this is a Google image search. These are the first Google images that come up when I search breast cancer. So you see how pervasive this particular narrative around femininity and and stereotypical gender, like femininity around heterosexual white gender norms, right? You see the bodies that are represented here, the colors that are represented. If you do a search for BRCA genetic testing, these are two advertisements from two companies that offer genetic testing for the BRCA genes. On the left it says everyone has BRCA genes, but a lot of the color coding is still quite feminized. And on the right, it says BRCA1 and BRCA2. And then you actually have a female body that is white, that is wearing pink, that is taking the shape of a pink ribbon. And if you look at surgery for BRCA gene mutation carriers, you also see predominant, across most of the images, are images of white, thin, stereotypically feminine bodies. But who gets breast cancer? Everybody. Everybody gets breast cancer. Not just stereotypically white, feminine, middle-class women, even though they're the ones that are most represented. Cis men get breast cancer, and trans, queer, and gender nonconforming folks also get breast cancer. So I'm showing this image because you also see how there are stereotypical images then of cis heteromasculinity also being portrayed, right? The military salute. There are a few things actually within breast cancer culture and assumptions around gender norms that lead to actual biases within medical practice. So in the case of BRCA testing, for example, cis men are not, their genetic testing for cis men is not covered under insurance. It's not recommended. There are also, even though men are carriers of BRCA gene mutations, and even though BRCA gene mutations do increase men's risk for cancers, skin cancers, prostate cancers, breast cancers, not as significantly as they do for people who are assigned female at birth, but still significantly. So this means that men within the policies are actually excluded from access to genetic testing because of eligibility requirements. And then there are also norms around, a stigma particularly around masculinity, that lead men to oftentimes not talk about and not seek treatment as regularly. There's another population that tends to be excluded from this umbrella of cancers that are women's cancers. So this is an image, actually. Mary Bryson is faculty over at UBC, and they are doing a really cool project right now called Cancer's Margins, that's specifically around cancer experience for those who are trans and gender nonconforming. And this is an image from a piece called Resisterectomy, where Mary and Chase both talk about their experiences dealing with cancer and cancer risk as people who are trans and gender nonconforming. Now, things that happen for those with it who are not represented within the broader gender norms of cancer culture, at a women's cancer center, Chase feels quite out of place. Things like the forms have Ms. and then fill it in. Chase doesn't feel represented and supported in those spaces. And then there are other things too around surgery practices. So while breast reconstruction is encouraged for people who are undergoing preventive mastectomies or cancer treatment mastectomies, other options for reconstruction, such as chest contouring surgery to masculize your chest, are not made as readily available. So you also see how certain biases actually inhere within the system that make it such that certain populations are marginalized based upon their gender identity. Also, while some people like Jolie might say this is an incredibly difficult decision and I mourn the loss of my breast, which is a pretty common narrative, someone like Mary said, wow, like my cancer diagnosis also is going to affirm my gender, like getting a bilateral mastectomy actually affirms my gender, but at the same time, because it's affirming my gender, there's also suspicion around me, so it's like, and I might not get access to chest contouring surgery the way that someone else might get access to breast reconstruction. So there are a few other things that affect everyone who's dealing with genetic cancer risk. The options available to manage your risk, and so this is actually a page from my graphic novel that's coming out in November. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things that happens when you find out that you have genetic risk for cancer is that you are given options about how to manage your risk, because your risk is considerably elevated. So one of the options is to watch and wait, which is regular screenings to see if you can catch the cancer early. But ovarian cancer screening, for example, is very ineffective, and there are high mortality rates for ovarian cancer. So it's not ideal. The other option that's considered the gold standard right now is to remove healthy breasts and ovaries. These are not ideal options, and while for some people they may be gender affirming, for a lot of people it's still a very difficult choice, and the side effects are considerable. Now, another thing that happens is when you're faced with a choice like this, cancer risk becomes an individual and personal responsibility, which means that all the other complex environmental and social and political factors that contribute to elevated risk for cancer are not addressed, but instead you intervene in your own body to reduce your risk, rather than, for example, accounting for other things that increase your risk. Because the other thing is, like, risk is not the same thing as certainty. When you find out that you have elevated risk for cancer, it doesn't mean that you will 100% get cancer. It means that you're more susceptible to environmental risks. So when you are put in a position where you need to make a really difficult decision about bodily intervention based upon this risk, there are there's guilt, personal responsibility, a lot of other things that come along with this that deflect attention away from the larger environmental causes of genetic cancers like BRCA cancers and 90 to 95% of other cancers. Something that's less of a bummer is that there are really interesting things that we can learn from people who are managing their genetic risk. So when most people get diagnosed with an illness, it's like a present pathology. You know, like you have tuberculosis and we have located through this test. But when someone is thinking about treating genetic risk when they are healthy, they actually do a lot of the work of manifesting the conditions to treat a disease within their social and intimate and familial worlds and not within the context of the clinic. Now, for those of us who have backgrounds in feminist science studies or in medical anthropology, this is something that we already know, that illness experiences are always taking place within our social worlds, and that medical decision-making is also inflected by larger social norms and assumptions and values. But with BRCA genetic testing, this is made absolutely evident, because for those who decide that they want to get preventive surgeries, and what they call it previving cancer, and incidentally, today in the US is National Previvor Day. So coincidentally. Anyway, so for those who are previving cancer, a lot of the rationales that they use to make sense of their risk and determine whether or not to treat their risk through surgery or through pharmacological intervention is through understandings of the experiences of those around them who have had cancer. So this is an image, again, from the graphic novel of our character who finds that she carries a genetic mutation. And the text follows her as she starts going through the exact same rituals of cancer that her mother went through, and that her aunt went through, and that her grandmother went through. But she's healthy, but she's following their steps and put in a position where she has to determine what risks am I willing to live with, and how do I make this medical decision. And a lot of the ways that people make these medical decisions have to do with understanding your body's connection to other loved ones' bodies. So talking about waiting until I turn the same age that my mom was when she got cancer, because that's when I'm going to get cancer. Saying I look a lot like my mom, so that means that I probably have the same likelihood of getting the cancer that she did. Or this killed my sister, and my sister said, you have to get this surgery because if you don't, like, I'll never forgive myself because one of us has to survive. So these kinds of familial pressures that people experience too. You know, also if you have a BRCA gene and you don't have a strong family history, maybe because it's passed down through the father's side, then you also might not feel a sense of urgency because you haven't been watching people die of cancer for generations in your family. So these things really shape people's medical decision making. So what happens is you see that a lot of the knowledge around cancer comes from social networks and from intimate networks and from forms of knowledge that we tend to think of as not conventionally medical. So this is another page from the graphic novel where we see different characters in Anna's life weighing in on what they think she should do. Her best friend, Layla, is Egyptian, and Layla's like, why would you do this to yourself? My father can't even get treatment for his kidney disease. Why would you treat this disease you don't even have by removing healthy organs? You know, her mother's like, do whatever you want, sweetie. You know, the doctors are like, no, you got it, like, by 35, you should have those ovaries out. So you see how a lot of different factors play into this that aren't purely medical, but nonetheless inflect medical decisions and actually produce the conditions to treat something like a medical condition. So in the history of cancer genetics, this has actually been the case consistently. So this is a pedigree of a family cancer history. The black dots are people who died of cancer. This is from actually the 1890s and then published in the 1900s. This cancer pathologist, Aldred Worthen's seamstress, came up to him and she was like, I'm going to die of cancer. Everyone in my family has died of cancer. Like, is there anything you can do to help me or to determine whether or not this is hereditary? Because we know that there's something going on here. At the time, Worthen tried to publish it. It was discounted as fringe science. This was discounted as folk knowledge. In the 1960s, researchers started coming back to this and encountering more people who identified as cancer families. And through meticulous records kept by oftentimes like women in families about family cancer histories, they started asking research questions. And a lot of the reasons why they were able to do the genetic cancer research and locate a gene had everything, like had a good deal to do with the work that families were already doing because they knew that cancer was hereditary. But they needed medical validation for them to take measures. Okay, so these are some kind of cool things. One of the issues, though, and this is where I'm going to turn to the test itself, is that not everybody has access to participate in these regimes of medical knowledge production equally. And in the context of the US, for example, a lot of this has to do with who has access to insurance coverage. It also has to do with larger issues around forms of medical discrimination and bias. Medical practitioners are consistently less likely to refer racial minorities to get genetic testing, for example. Also, those who tend to be poor and uninsured because of norms of race stratification tend to be racialized minorities. And so what this means is that and then there's this other layer, which is up until the 1990s, and still continuing to a lesser degree, but still, is an assumption that white patients and white bodies are neutral or universal. And so a lot of medical research has been undertaken with white identified patients. And then also there are some white identified patient groups that have been really ideal for genetic research, like Mormons and Ashkenazi Jewish populations, because they keep meticulous records and because they're much more kind of closely interknit in terms of marital practices. So what this means is that those who have not been getting regular genetic testing, research has not been conducted in populations to account for all the different variations and mutations in BRCA genes. So for someone who might get access to a genetic test for a BRCA mutation, who is a racialized minority, for example, like a black woman in the US, up until 2015, it was more likely for those populations to get something called a variation of uncertain significance, which means they knew that there was a mutation in your BRCA gene, but they hadn't done enough research on that mutation to figure out whether or not it was actually linked to breast cancer risk. So then you have this bizarre status of being at risk, but you don't get insurance coverage for surgeries, screenings, other things like that. Now, to be clear, this isn't because racial subgroups are biologically meaningful categories. So for example, Angelina Jolie carries what's called a Jewish gene. She does not identify as Jewish. She doesn't have Jewish ancestry. It's more that if you cast a small net, you're only going to catch certain variations. If you catch a wider net, you're going to catch more variations. But because certain subgroups keep getting tested over and over again, there are certain variations that aren't accounted for. Right? So it actually produces conditions of racial exclusion, even though the exclusion isn't actually based upon racial biology, if that makes sense. Now, patients are actually really critically aware of this. There's been a few really good studies in the past few years working specifically with minoritarian and marginalized patients within genetic cancer regimes. And so there's one study that came out by Galen Joseph, who's a sociologist, and she was working with women in the US who identify as African American, who have strong family histories of cancer, who would be great candidates for genetic testing. And what she found when working with them was that they were far less concerned about an individualized genetic risk for cancer that they could treat than they were concerned about forms of medical discrimination, forms of political inequality, and economic inequality that were making them more likely to be sick. And that were making it harder for them to access consistently good medical care and put in a position where they had to consistently advocate for themselves. So these patients were actually leveling a really powerful critique of a kind of individualized discourse of genetic risk and inheritance by saying, well, the things that I'm more concerned about are inheritances of social political inequality and the ways in which those negatively impact my health. And a really cool thing is that a lot of doctors are people who have experienced this. And a number of doctors are also turning and listening to these patient populations and recognizing that, and these are images from the White Coats for Black Lives campus movement at University of US, I think, I'm blanking.
California.
Thank you. But they've staged sit-ins and protests to draw attention to the ways in which racialized inequalities get embedded within medical care, oftentimes without a lot of awareness, and how this negatively impacts people's health, and also drawing attention to the fact that things like police racialized violence on the part of police is a medical issue. People are dying. People's health is impaired by this. So something that I want to conclude with at this point is I want to bring us back to a central question that we tend to ask in feminist science studies. And this is, there's an idea that's called standpoint epistemology. And part of the idea is that all knowledge comes from somewhere. There's no God's eye view where you look down on the world and you can see everything totally neutrally and objectively. All knowledge comes from somewhere. People produce knowledge, and that has effects. And so the question becomes whose perspectives are being represented in scientific or medical knowledge. And oftentimes, as I've shown you through this, it tends to be a really specific, dominant, normative worldview that doesn't account for those who don't fit within that ideal. So when you turn and you look to those who are most marginalized within a system, they oftentimes have some of the most important insights into how that system works, because they can see how the system doesn't work. Right? Like how the system doesn't actually work for them. The patients that Joseph was working with were very aware of the fact that genetic testing doesn't necessarily work for me because of forms of discrimination. Or, yeah, my cancer risk is also really elevated because I live in an area that is more susceptible to environmental exposures. I mean, think about Chemical Valley, for example, and other spaces. What are the populations that tend to live in places that have uneven forms of environmental exposures and toxins? So when you start from the standpoint of those most marginalized, you ask different questions. And oftentimes those questions help you to come up with more just and more equitable answers. Because when you ask different questions, you produce different answers in research, and you generate different practice. So one of the things that's been a crucial concern for me as I've moved through my research is if we start from the standpoints of those most marginalized within genetic cancer risk regimes, for instance, and we find out what their insights are about what's not working for the system, about how their bodies are connected to other bodies, then we're going to come up with different definitions of genetics or inheritance, and then we're going to come up with different ideas about how we intervene in these things medically, public health-wise, politically. So I turn to Standing Rock and the water protectors as an example of this too, because these are two examples where, so one, we can take Angelina Jolie and we can say, well, actually, there's something really interesting what's happening with her, because her genetic risk is not individualized. It's actually connected to all these other bodies in her family, and a sense of obligation to take care of her children, or an awareness that cancer took her mother away, so it could take her away from her children. So this idea that like our bodies are genetically connected and not autonomous and individualized. And then you can turn to this and you can say, well, there are these other ideas that we can think about too, like what types of inheritances are we drawing upon? So what types of inheritances are you intervening in for, for an African-American woman if she feels that she's at greater risk for medical discrimination or environmental toxicity? Then those are inheritances that you also have to account for when you're undertaking genetic research. Or if you shift and you look at the Standing Rock water protectors, you also have to think about like the connections between one's body and the land, and environmental forms of inheritance, and also forms of dispossession that put certain people at greater risk for bodily wearing out through cancer or other diseases. So that then it shifts the framework away from a hyper-individualized, hyper-medical form of treatment to a more justice-based form of treatment that works in tandem with that, and not as something that is separate, where we'll treat the body and we'll leave the rest of it to legislation. Because the body, and this is where I'm going to end, as Donna Haraway has famously told us, does not end at the skin. And genetics is a great space for us to start to see that if we start turning to the perspectives of those who have the most insight into that. And that is all. Thank you.
Okay, this is over to Terry and Nathan. I'd like to invite you up here, okay, to share the camera. And I'm going to suggest maybe you stand on either side here of Dr. Nye. And who would like to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. You were able to collaborate on that. That's great. All right.
Okay, so I'm kind of returning to your first points, and you kind of touched on it when you talked about standpoint, but what are some useful first steps individuals involved in the biomedical field and sciences can take in unraveling and confronting the biases and unconsidered assumptions around gender that you've presented in your talk very astutely?
Okay, thank you, Nathan. This is a really good question. So I think there are a lot of places, I mean, this feels like maybe a shameless plug for the humanities and social sciences, but this is a really great example of, like, scientists and medical researchers often aren't trained in accounting for the ways in which gender norms inflect technologies, medical practice, the ways in which the larger, the histories of medicine as a tool of colonization or oppression, the histories of racial categories or gender categories, and the ways in which medical practice has oftentimes participated, often like imagining itself to be beneficent, but participated in reproducing norms that have landed on people's bodies quite violently. And so, I think one is actually in medical school incorporating training on gender, race, history, and the ways in which these categories are moving targets, and the ways in which their practice is already infused with certain power relations and carry certain histories with it. So I think that's a first step. I also think that we need to really rethink the ways in which we understand expertise. I think one of the things that we see from this presentation is patients actually have a lot of expertise about their illness and about their experience and about what they need. And a lot of really powerful patient movements have come out to shift the stories that are getting told and the ways in which practices are unfolding within medical and scientific fields. But oftentimes the people who are doing that work also have access to resources. So those who are oftentimes most marginalized are those who are least in a position to articulate their critiques or their needs. And so I think doing really much more careful outreach, I think team practices around having a research team that has people from multiple different perspectives and not a kind of singular perspective. And for always accounting for a body within a larger field of relations. You aren't just treating a leg. or a breast. You are treating a person, and you are treating a person within a larger cultural context.
Great. Nathan, would you slide it over to Terry there, and we'll alternate back and forth.
So at the start of your talk, you were talking about stories and how that's linked to science. And I was just thinking about, near the end, you went on to kind of non-biological inheritances. And I was thinking, is there a risk that when scientists start looking into that, there's an opportunity there for that to be used in a different way, where it further marginalises groups? And how do we, as academics, specifically in arts and social sciences, challenge that?
That's a great question. Yeah, so this is, so in my class today, I read about epigenetics, and this is something that's really coming to the fore in new epigenetics research, and I'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, so I think I would say two things. One is that the things that I'm pointing to are biological. The inheritances that I'm pointing to do wear out bodies differently and do shape our biologies. But what you're saying too is that what are the dangers then of saying, well, you know, centuries of dispossession for indigenous peoples has worn out their health, and that is an inheritance that has been that has taken a tremendous amount from people and from their health. And you know, that narrative could be mobilized to then say, well, this population is genetically inferior, which is a really and be used to advance kind of neo-eugenic ends. Another way that could be framed, though, is to say this is an inheritance that we have to address. If we recognize that if we in the medical field care about people's health, and this is a priority, then we have to address the larger structures that are in place that make people more likely to get sick, and people in these populations more likely to get sick. Because biology is plastic, and biology is always taking shape in relation to our larger social context. And so we have to intervene in those social contexts in order to shift the biological narratives. And with epigenetics, it's really cool because what we're learning is there's a thing, epi, on top of your genome that can signal or turn on or off different coding regions of your genome. And those are triggered by the environment. But that means that you can also inherit the negative inheritances. If someone 2 generations ago was starving, then you could potentially inherit that. But the other side of that is that they are also reversible. So it also produces the conditions to say we need to intervene in this because look, it is making people sick. And it is like disproportionately impacting people through a form of inheritance. And so because of that, we should make these interventions. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is why we need like bioethicists and other folks to be asking these questions and be very careful and attentive to the risks of reducing things to a biological problem. Yeah.
A supplementary? Either or both of you? Maybe anything else you want to Well, that was great. That was a good start. We can now open it up to the audience, and I would be delighted with questions. I'll sort of be the Sherpa here, passing on the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for your sharing. So it's fascinating. So my question will be, how, as you mentioned, this is a kind of medical discourse that is shaped around white women and social injustice. So do you think that this kind of thing is actually a kind of scientific racism that is towards women, especially when it's quite aligned with neoliberalism, while like medical firms are finding, for example, the BRCA genes to actually earn money because they're actually targeting white like middle-class women instead of doing for the black women or racial minorities, which they cannot afford these kind of things. So do you think that is a kind of like neoliberalist thinking that that kind of BRCA genes is like a construct instead of a real thing? I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
So I hear you asking a question about kind of is there like a neoliberal dimension to this? And I'm not entirely sure what you're asking about the question around race and gender specifically.
Oh, because like the whole, as you mentioned, the whole medical research is actually done mainly on white women. So maybe this kind of like construct is actually how medical firms want to target these kind of women in order to actually get the money. For example, they will think about, oh, let me get my breast reduced. They will think about this, and they can actually earn money from that. And because like some of the racial minority or class minority cannot get this sort of thing, so they don't actually want to help them. Maybe this kind of thing actually shaped by this kind of medical discourse.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So neoliberalism absolutely is a context in which a lot of BRCA genetic research and medical practice is unfolding. And part of this, like there's another dimension of the story I talk about in my book about gene patenting. And so, and in Canada this still hasn't been addressed by the Supreme Court, but in the US and Australia in 2015, or maybe it was 2013. The Supreme Court decided that you cannot patent genes, but and this was around the BRCA genes because one company, a biotech company, Myriad Genetics Incorporated, had exclusive rights to all research and testing on the BRCA genes. So what this meant is that this one company then dictated the field around which who could access the test. So then the test cost $3,000 because Myriad set the test. And in a place like Canada, you could access it, but there are also strict protocols around who gets referrals and who can access it. And then if you want to access it otherwise by just like sending in a blood sample, then you have to be able to afford it and then go through another route in the US. So yeah, a lot of this is inextricable from a larger context of like commercialization and the commodification of health in terms of targeting certain populations that can afford this. I mean, risk taking on all the characteristics of disease because, it's interesting, right? In the history of capitalism and industrial capitalism, you needed people to be healthy so they could work, right? If they're sick, they can't go to the factory, and then you lose money, right? This is but within this particular context, pharmaceutical industry is one of the most powerful money makers globally, and so it actually makes a lot of sense for people to consume drugs and to be sick enough so that they can work, sick enough so that they can get treatment, but not so sick that they have to go to work. And obviously this is like a little bit conspiratorial. Like there are, like I do think that like women should have access to genetic testing, like, and so I don't dispute that, but I think that it's overdetermined by a commercial field in which this is unevenly distributed, and within a larger pharmaceutical industry that is trying to increase risk thresholds. Like so, Lipitor is another example of this. Like lowering cholesterol risk thresholds, medicalizing everything, treating obesity with the newest drug, treating attention deficit disorder with the newest, like coming up with new diagnoses when you have a drug that you find out works for them. And so it is happening in that field. I don't think that we can then just like get rid of it, but I think we'd be very critical of the ways in which knowledge production is happening within this for-profit industry. And then in terms of research subjects, if you're interested in people who get paid for research, so people don't get paid for their genetic research, like it's for genetic, like in terms of the genetic test. Myriad just has exclusive rights over your genes, or it did until 2013. But once someone takes a genetic sample, you have very little control over this. And there have been a lot of disputes, especially among First Nations people, about what's being done with their DNA samples, what kind of research is being done that actually works against them, and who has and why are these scientists coming in and making claims on their biological properties, and then conducting research that oftentimes isn't and to their benefit. And so, I think one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about is opening up the way that we think about inheritance in particular, to really challenge understandings of biology and property. So biology as an individual property, and then also like property, like biology as a thing that we can own. Because I think that they're really problematic.
Excellent. Second question over here. Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for your sharing your knowledge and experience. My question is about the many people are doing tests on introvert and extrovert, and then they are permanently labeled that you won't be able to be open about your stories compared to extrovert and so on. What do you think of that? And what about the sperm bank? Because sperm bank, is also following all the history of the past of person's history, and then if you want a sperm of somebody, I mean, then it is kind of categorize what items. And I agree with you, because I did my training in medical statistics and epidemiology, and they were often using indicators like illegitimate children. And I've always wondered, do mothers know that their children are illegitimate, or it's just...
Yeah, so that's a really great point, right? Because what you're pointing to is, depending on what categories we think are meaningful, we're going to come up with really different research answers, and depending on what categories we use, right? So if you think illegitimate child is a category, one, and is a meaningful category that we can measure and is useful in a study, then it's going to impact the kind of research that we do. With the introvert-extrovert thing, I mean, this is another example of like, well, like, there are lots of different dimensions of all of our personalities and moving through the world, and most of us aren't like, I never want to talk to anyone, or, right? Like, it's contextual, and it changes over time and over the course of our lives. And so I think there are limitations to trying to find a biological mechanism at the root of that. And then I think another question I have to ask is, like, to what end? Like, why? What are we going to do with that work, and why is it useful, and for whom is it useful to do that kind of work? And with the sperm bank stuff, I mean, yeah, this is another example, like sperm banks and egg donors is another space where you can really see problematic racial, class, gender norms playing out. So egg donors oftentimes, I mean, like the ideal egg donor gets more money for their eggs if they are a white woman of European descent with an Ivy League degree, I mean, it's of a certain height with a certain hair color. I mean, and it's yeah, I mean, eugenics isn't something that is of the past. It is something that we're still very much reckoning with. And the same thing with sperm donors, yeah.
Anyone else? I have time for one last question, at least for this portion of the program. I have one. Science studies in Canada today are difficult to finance. The proportion of funding that happens from the tri-councils and so on that is actually devoted to arts and humanities and social sciences study in health is very, very small. In terms of the incredible scientific innovations that are going to be confronting this society, and our need not only to struggle ethically, but also in terms of our anthropological and cultural understandings of the encoding of meaning in science today, what can we do about this? I mean, how can we as scholars and students in a university try to influence national discourses to move science policy and open it up to include research in non-traditional ways like you're doing? I mean, I love the idea of storming Parliament Hill with graphic novels and the case in favor of funding arts and social science financing today. I'm not sure whether that would help, but it certainly would get attention.
Well, so it's really interesting, right? Like, I think that we have a real problem with like the ways in which we think about disciplines, and I think that disciplines are one of like and you see this in funding structures. You see this like in the organization of the university right now. Like, I think that there's a hierarchy that's in place that the sciences are somehow outside of the social sciences, and but in fact they're so interconnected, and I think that Genome Canada is actually doing some interesting stuff where they're saying like we're going to fund teams of people from all different disciplinary backgrounds to ask questions around genomic research in Canada. So I think that's like a promising space. But the other thing is doctors teach with comics. Like there's like this really cool field called graphic medicine where medical doctors, when they're training residents, use comics to teach the medical students about patient experience, because it's like comics are actually really helpful because you can convey all sorts of things about your experience through like cartoony drawings, right? Like, and there are a lot of really wonderful illness memoirs that people have written about their illness experiences, you know. And another thing I think that like we should really think carefully about too is, you know, so TEK, for example, is a growing field, like traditional ecological knowledge that is drawing from indigenous knowledge systems and saying like, look at how much, like, duh, but like look at how much indigenous peoples know about ecological thinking and environmental practice. But I think one of the real problems with that is like it has to be decolonized. It can't keep happening within a scientific framework that says bring this piecemeal into a knowledge framework that says there are fixed ways of knowing, our bodies end at the skin. I mean, a lot of indigenous knowledge systems are already doing this work and aren't divided around disciplines. And so I think a lot of this is also about finding ways to decolonize and really support indigenous knowledge around these issues as well.
I think this is a classically great segue and end for Canada 150 Plus. Thank you to Dr. Nye for a really stimulating discussion, and thank you for coming today. I'm going to argue that we should stick around and eat, because there's lots to eat, apparently, is there? And I mean that most sincerely, eat and talk. And on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, we have a token of our appreciation that actually is sharing an Indigenous artifact. And we thank you very much for your contributions today.